All right, so with Trump winning last night, you really need to hear about this thing.
Yeah.
Remember Project 2025, that massive plan to like reshape the U.S. government?
Right.
Well, with this win, things just got a lot more interesting
Yeah.
because of this addendum called Project Esther.
Mm.
And let me tell you, it's raising some serious red flags.
Well, the timing of it all is just wild. The Heritage Foundation released it like exactly 1 year after the Hamas attacks on Israel.
Oh, wow.
But it's clearly meant for like a willing administration, you know?
Right.
With Trump back in the White House, it's not just some think tank document anymore.
Yeah, it's like they had this thing just waiting in the wings.
Right.
Okay, so Project Esther, it specifically targets something they call the Hamas support network here in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
What exactly does that even mean?
Well, it's a really broad term that they use to lump together a really diverse range of groups.
Okay.
Think student activists like Students for Justice in Palestine, organizations like American Muslims for Palestine and Jewish Voice for Peace, even big philanthropic foundations like the Tides Foundation and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund.
Hold on, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. That's a
Yeah.
pretty big name to just throw around.
Right.
What's their basis for connecting all these groups?
Well, that's where it gets really strange.
Okay.
The document claims these groups' motivations are somehow rooted in the Communist Manifesto.
Wow.
They're painting this picture of like a vast coordinated network driven by some hidden radical agenda.
So how do they plan to deal with this so-called network?
Yeah.
Because from what I've heard, Project Esther isn't exactly about gentle persuasion.
You're right about that. It lays out a pretty aggressive strategy using legal action, financial audits, and public pressure campaigns to essentially shut these groups down.
What kind of legal action are we talking about here?
They actually propose using Aracoco statutes.
RECO statutes.
Yeah, which are laws typically used to go after organized crime.
Right.
They want to deny these organizations access to public funds, pressure institutions to withhold funding, and basically brand them as criminal enterprises.
That's terrifying. We're talking about potentially using laws designed to combat the mafia against people who are advocating for Palestinian rights.
That's the gist of it.
Wow.
And it's not just financial pressure either. They also want to go after pro-Palestinian content in schools, remove supportive faculty,
Oh my God.
and even target foreign student visas based on activism.
So much for academic freedom, right?
Yeah.
It feels like they're trying to control the entire narrative around this issue, from the classroom to the courtroom to the public square.
And they're pretty open about their methods. There's this one quote from the document that really stood out to me.
Okay.
They talk about how they're going to exploit America's open society, basically use the very freedoms we supposedly cherish to silence dissent.
Wait, so they're saying our freedoms are somehow a weakness that they can exploit? That's pretty twisted.
It definitely raises some serious concerns about how they view freedom of speech assembly and even academic freedom. They basically argue that these freedoms are being weaponized against them and therefore justify extreme measures.
It's like they're twisting the whole concept of freedom on its head. And to make matters worse, they've set a ridiculously aggressive timeline for all of this, just 12 to 24 months.
It's like they're in a rush to implement this vision before anyone can mount a serious opposition.
Yeah.
And that brings us back to the election. With Trump back in office, there's a real chance that Project Esther could go from a fringe document to official policy.
Okay, but hold on. The whole premise of Project Esther is that it's about combating anti-Semitism.
Right.
But I've also heard that even some Jewish groups are hesitant to get involved.
Yeah.
What's going on there?
You're right. There are reports that several Jewish organizations have expressed concerns about the project's extreme tactics
Okay.
and ties to Christian nationalist groups. They see it as an overreach that could actually harm the Jewish community in the long run.
So it's not just a fringe idea within the broader political landscape. It's even causing divisions within the very community it claims to protect.
Exactly.
That's definitely something to think about.
Absolutely. And it raises questions about who this project is really for and what its true goals are. I mean, even the name Project Esther itself is a biblical reference to a queen who saved Jews from genocide.
There's definitely a lot of irony there, given what they're proposing to do to these activist groups. It's like they're using the language of protection to justify oppression.
And it's not just vague threats either. The document actually names specific members of Congress, labeling them the Hamas caucus and accusing them of being anti-Semitic and anti-American.
Wait, they're literally calling out individual lawmakers? This is getting more and more unsettling by the minute.
They specifically complain that Jewish lawmakers didn't unanimously support censuring Representative Rashida Tlaib for using the phrase from the river to the sea, which they interpret as a call for Israel's destruction.
For those of us who may not be familiar, could you explain what that phrase means and why it's so controversial?
Sure, so it's a phrase that represents different things to different people. For some Palestinians, it refers to the entire historical land of Palestine from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea,
Okay.
and is used to express their longing for a homeland. However, some pro-Israel groups view it as a call to eliminate Israel, entirely replacing it with a Palestinian state. So it's a highly charged phrase, and its interpretation often depends on one's political stance.
And to top it all off, this document completely ignores actual white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups. You know, the kind that actually promote violence and hatred against Jews. It just seems so incredibly selective.
You're picking up on a key point here.
Yeah.
If this project is truly about combating anti-Semitism, why the laser focus on pro-Palestinian activism while ignoring these much more demonstrably dangerous groups?
It's a question that deserves an answer.
Huh.
It's starting to feel like this isn't about protecting anyone from hatred. It's about silencing any criticism of Israel, no matter how legitimate.
And that's where the real danger lies. If they succeed in shutting down these voices, it sets a chilling precedent for anyone who dares to challenge those in power. It could stifle dissent on a whole range of issues far beyond the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
This whole thing is incredibly disturbing. It's like a blueprint for suppressing any opposition to their agenda.
Yeah.
And with Trump back in the White House, who knows what could happen next?
That's the big question, isn't it? We know the plan, we see the potential consequences, and now we have a political landscape where it could actually become a reality. It's definitely a situation that demands our attention. And it's not like these tactics are completely new. We've already seen attempts to use legal and financial pressure to silence activists. Like, remember a controversy over using IRA COCO statutes against those protesting the Cop City development.
Oh, yeah. And there was that case recently where they designated a Palestinian prisoner solidarity movement as a terrorist group.
Exactly. So Project Esther is taking tactics that are already being used and putting them on steroids. It's like they're taking a page from an authoritarian playbook, but with an American twist.
And if we connect this back to Project 2025, it starts to look even more alarming. We're not just talking about silencing a few activists here. This is part of a much larger effort to reshape the entire power structure of the U.S. government.
That's a really important point. Project 2025 is all about installing loyalists throughout the federal bureaucracy, weakening regulatory agencies, and basically giving the executive branch unchecked power. Project Esther fits right into that vision by eliminating any potential opposition.
So it's like they're creating a two-pronged attack. Control the levers of power from within and silence any dissent from the outside. Not exactly a recipe for a healthy democracy, is it?
It's a pretty chilling thought, isn't it? To think that we could be headed towards a future where the government controls the narrative, suppresses dissenting views, and punishes anyone who dares to challenge the status quo.
Okay, so let's talk about the potential consequences here. What does this actually mean for everyday Americans? If Project Esther becomes a reality, how could it affect our lives?
Well, the most immediate impact would likely be a chilling effect on activism. And people could be afraid to speak out on a whole range of issues, not just Palestine.
I mean, if you could be branded as a criminal or a terrorist sympathizer for supporting Palestinian rights, who's to say what other causes could be targeted next?
Exactly. It could create a climate of fear and self-censorship where people are hesitant to express their views or associate with groups that might be deemed controversial.
And that's incredibly dangerous for a democracy. We need open dialogue, debate, and dissent to hold those in power accountable.
You're absolutely right. And it's not just about silencing individual voices. It's about controlling the entire narrative, shaping public perception, and ultimately limiting the range of ideas that are considered acceptable in public discourse.
Now, let's not forget that Project Esther specifically calls out the media as part of the problem. They accuse them of being biased against Israel and contributing to the rise of anti-Semitism in the U.S.
They basically want to control the flow of information, discrediting any media outlets that don't align with their worldview, and pushing their own propaganda through sympathetic channels.
It's classic media manipulation, right? They're trying to create an echo chamber where dissenting voices are drowned out and their own narrative goes unchallenged.
Exactly. And that's incredibly dangerous in a world where disinformation and propaganda are already rampant. It's becoming harder and harder for people to discern fact from fiction, and this kind of manipulation only makes it worse.
But it's not like everyone is just blindly accepting this narrative. We talked earlier about how some Jewish groups are pushing back against Project Esther. Can you tell us more about their perspective?
Many Jewish organizations are deeply concerned about the implications of this project. They see it as a dangerous overreach that could actually harm the Jewish community in the long run by fueling anti-Semitism and creating a climate of fear and division.
It's like they're saying, hey, we're the ones you claim to be protecting, and we're telling you this is a bad idea. Pretty powerful statement, right?
Absolutely. Their voices are crucial in highlighting the complexity of this issue and the dangers of conflating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism.
It's a reminder that this isn't a monolithic issue.
Mhm.
There are diverse perspectives even within the Jewish community, and we need to be careful about painting everyone with a broad brush.
And that's a good reminder for all of us. This isn't just about Palestine or Israel or even anti-Semitism. This is about freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of thought. It's about our fundamental right to dissent, to challenge those in power, and to hold different views without fear of reprisal.
So what do we do about it? It feels like we're facing a real threat here, but it can also feel incredibly overwhelming. How do we even begin to counter something as insidious and well-funded as Project Esther?
Well, I think the first step is awareness. We need to understand the threat, see how it connects to these broader trends, and be able to articulate the dangers to others.
It's like shining a light on the cockroaches,
Yeah.
right? They can't operate in the open if people are aware of what they're doing.
Yeah, exactly. And once people are aware, they can start to organize, mobilize, and put pressure on their elected officials to protect our fundamental freedoms.
So it's not just about being informed ourselves. It's about spreading the word, educating others, and building a movement to resist this kind of authoritarian creep.
Absolutely. And it's about supporting organizations that are fighting for civil liberties, holding our elected officials accountable, and demanding that they uphold the Constitution.
Okay, so awareness, education, and action. But there's also the media piece to consider. How do we navigate this increasingly fragmented and manipulated information landscape? How do we know what to believe anymore?
It's a tough one. We need to be critical consumers of information, always questioning our assumptions, seeking out diverse perspectives, and being wary of sources that play to our biases.
It sounds like a lot of work. But if we want to preserve our democracy and our freedoms, it's work we can't afford to ignore.
You're absolutely right. And I think it's also important to remember that we're not alone in this fight. There are countless individuals and organizations across the country who are dedicated to protecting democracy and ensuring that everyone has a voice.
It can be easy to feel powerless in the face of something as big and scary as Project Esther. But
Yeah.
you're right, there is strength in numbers.
And that's where the power of collective action comes in. When people come together, raise their voices, and demand change, it can have a profound impact on the course of history.
You know, as we've been talking about all of this, it really feels like we're at a crossroads here.
Yeah.
Trump's back in the White House, Project Esther's out there, and the potential consequences are just enormous. It's hard not to feel a bit overwhelmed, to be honest.
I understand that feeling. It can be really daunting to confront something this big and complex.
Right.
But that's precisely why we need to break it down,
Right.
Understand the potential scenarios and figure out how to navigate this new reality.
Okay, so let's game this out a bit. What are some of the possible paths we could see unfolding from here? Like if Project Esther is actually put into action, what could it look like?
Well, one scenario is a pretty grim one, frankly.
Oh, yeah.
The government could use its power to really crack down on dissent. We could see a wave of prosecutions, restrictions on freedoms, maybe even a climate of fear where people are too afraid to speak out or associate with certain groups.
It's like that classic dystopian novel come to life, right?
Right.
Where everyone is constantly looking over their shoulder, afraid to say the wrong thing or be seen with the wrong people.
It's a chilling thought, but unfortunately it's not without precedent. We've seen similar things happen in other countries and even in our own history, There have been periods where dissent was met with harsh repression.
But couldn't this also backfire spectacularly?
Oh, yeah.
Wouldn't such a blatant attack on freedom galvanize opposition and maybe even strengthen the very movements they're trying to silence?
That's definitely another possibility. History shows us that attempts to suppress dissent can actually have the opposite effect.
Yeah.
It can spark outrage, fuel resistance, and create a sense of solidarity among those who are being targeted.
It's like squeezing a balloon, right?
Mhm.
You might be able to contain it in one spot, but the pressure just builds up somewhere else.
Yeah.
Eventually, something's got to give.
Exactly. And given the current political climate with all the existing tensions and divisions, a crackdown like this could really backfire.
Right.
It could energize opposition groups, create new alliances, and potentially lead to even more unrest.
So it's a gamble. They might succeed in silencing some critics, but at what cost?
Right.
They could end up creating a much bigger problem for themselves in the long run.
That's the inherent risk of authoritarian tactics. They might seem effective in the short term, but they often create instability and resentment that can ultimately undermine the very power they seek to consolidate.
Okay, so there's the dystopian crackdown scenario, and then there's the possibility of a massive backlash.
Mm.
But is there some middle ground here? Could they maybe implement parts of Project Esther without triggering a full-blown crisis?
It's possible they could start with smaller, more targeted actions,
Okay.
testing the waters and seeing how much they can get away with. Maybe they focus on specific organizations or individuals using legal and financial pressure to make examples of them and discourage others from speaking out.
So a kind of death by a thousand cuts approach.
Yeah,
It's less dramatic than a full-blown crackdown, but it could still have a significant shelling effect over time.
exactly. It's a more insidious form of repression because it's harder to pinpoint and fight against. And because it happens gradually, it can be harder to mobilize public opposition.
This is all pretty heavy stuff. I mean, we're talking about potential threats to our basic freedoms here.
Yeah,
It's easy to feel helpless in the face of something like this.
I understand that. But I think it's important to remember that we're not powerless. We have a voice, we have a vote, and we have the ability to organize and hold those in power accountable.
So what can we do? What are some concrete steps we can take to counter this threat, to push back against Project Esther and the broader agenda it represents?
Well, as we talked about earlier, awareness is crucial. The more people understand what's happening, the better equipped they'll be to resist it. So talk to your friends, share information online, and make sure this issue stays on people's radar.
Education is also key, right? We need to equip ourselves with the knowledge and skills to navigate this increasingly complex information landscape.
Absolutely. Learn about the tactics being used to manipulate public opinion. Be critical of the information you consume and seek out diverse perspectives. Don't just rely on sources that confirm your existing biases.
And then there's the action piece.
Yeah.
What can we do beyond just talking and learning about this stuff? How do we actually make a difference?
There are lots of ways to get involved. Support organizations that are fighting for civil liberties, donate to legal defense funds, and contact your elected officials to express your concerns.
And don't underestimate the power of simply showing up, right? Attending protests, rallies, and community events can send a powerful message that we're not going to stand by and let our freedoms be eroded.
Exactly. When people come together and make their voices heard, it can have a real impact on the political landscape. It can force those in power to listen, to reconsider their actions, and to prioritize the needs and concerns of their constituents.
So it's about finding that balance between staying informed, taking action, and not letting the fear paralyze us. It's about recognizing that we have agency, that we can make a difference, and that the future of our democracy depends on our willingness to fight for it.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's easy to feel overwhelmed. But it's important to remember that even small actions can have a ripple effect. When enough people start pushing back, it can create a wave of change that even the most powerful forces can't ignore.
This deep dive into Project Esther has been sobering, to say the least.
Yeah.
But it's also been a reminder that we can't afford to be complacent. The future of our freedom, our democracy, and our very way of life depends on our willingness to stay informed, engage in critical thinking, and take action.
I couldn't agree more. The stakes are high, but the power to shape our future is in our hands. So let's use it wisely.